Thank you, Chen Wang, for introducing me, and I want to thank all the organizers for putting together this wonderful workshop. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. My name is Kalinda Ukanwa. I'm an assistant professor at USC's Marshall School of Business, and I'm going to share with you some research I did with my co-author, Roland Rust. It's called Algorithmic Discrimination in Service. Come on, slides. Okay. So let me start with this example of what this story is about. So this is really a research and a story about what are the downstream impacts, potential impact of algorithmic bias, specifically on demand. And I'm coming at it from a marketing context because I'm looking at the story of consumers and firms. So let me start with this story. This is a famous or infamous tweet, depending on how you think about it, about algorithmic bias and how it can generate word of mouth or WOM. We have David Hannemeyer Hansen, who is a technologist who back in November 2019 posted a tweet that accused the Apple Card of having an algorithm that was discriminatory against women. Steve Wozniak, who is the co-founder of Apple, made the same accusation, and both basically said, hey, we and our wives applied for an Apple Card. We share the same financial background, and yet we got much more favorable terms on this Apple Card than our wives. There must be discriminatory against women. So whether Apple Card's algorithm or not was truly discriminatory or intentionally discriminatory, and of course Apple said, nope, it was not intentional. What's interesting to me is some of the fallout, which is if you see in the circled areas here, generated a lot of word of mouth. I mean, the tweets themselves were word of mouth, and then it generated a lot of additional word of mouth around this, what appeared to be algorithmic bias. And so it taps into the questions that I am investigating with this research, which is, so under what conditions can algorithms really exhibit discrimination? And there's a lot of literature that has shown that, but is it different from humans? And there go my floating slides. Pardon me, while for some reason my slides seem to be advancing on their own sometimes. And also, what are some possible downstream effects of algorithmic discrimination on consumer demand? So in terms of what the literature has to say in algorithmic bias, there's a lot here. I'm only capturing some notable papers, but in general, we all understand algorithmic bias is systematically unfair outcomes from an algorithm that advantages a group over another, that the sources are generally from data or the design of the algorithm. It has had impact on many sectors in terms of impact on consumers, and in terms of this intended contribution, our intention is to demonstrate conditions where algorithmic bias can impact consumer demand and ultimately profits. What I'm going to look at is from the decision point of a firm, I'm going to compare two types of algorithms, and I'm going to have a model of what those algorithms are. I'm going to call them broadly group-aware algorithms versus group-blind algorithms, where group-aware algorithms are going to be using the information about groups. So, for example, let's say men and women, and it's based on gender, and it's going to develop an expectation of the quality of people within those groups, and then ultimately it will result in a cutoff or threshold for each group. In comparison, our group blind algorithms that will have one single cutoff or threshold that all people must clear to, if we're talking about consumers applying for a credit card or loan, et cetera, asking, applying for some kind of service where the algorithm screens them in advance. So let's take this example. Let's just call this person Rebecca. She applies for a credit card or a loan online, and the firm is going to use an algorithm to determine whether she should get that loan. And let's assume that Rebecca has a score of 65, but she has an underlying latent quality that's unobservable, which is a 50. Think of quality as the true value or profitability to the firm. And of course, the algorithm is trying to measure that through the data and its design. And then up in the upper right, I'm looking at this as a group aware algorithm that's using information about Rebecca and her history with loans and information about the group she comes from, in this example, women. And it's going to use that to estimate what her quality is as a loan recipient. And so in this particular group aware algorithm, if information is submitted to the algorithm, and then she's designated as part of the L group, I'm going to have two types of groups, an L group and an H group. You can think of a low type and high type based on average quality for the firm. Then, and she's a low type in this example, an L group type in this example, then she would not get the loan because her score doesn't sufficiently, it's not sufficiently high enough and does not cross the threshold. But if we were to resubmit her information and just change one thing, saying that she's from the H group, let's assume the H group is men, then she would get the loan because her score is high enough. What I'm defining in my paper as discrimination, algorithm discrimination, is the difference in the prediction and quality from the algorithm. So if it's trying to form an expectation of quality, that difference, even though nothing about her has changed in terms of score or quality, that difference in its prediction is what I'm defining and measuring as discrimination. So the question is, under what conditions can algorithms discriminate, and how is it different from humans? What I did is I first I did do an experiment where using an experiment of 400 M-Turkers, human beings, I asked them to play this loan game where they make decisions of who would get a loan. And so they're presented with 100 different brief application profiles, and they're asked to make a decision. The groups that they're looking at from these loans are what are called the triangles and the squares. And so half of the people in that experiment see the group information in each application, and then the other half do not. But they're asked to to make decisions based on the other information, including a score, who gets a loan and who doesn't. And then I do a second experiment where I have an algorithm, a simplified algorithm who's making the same kind of decisions. And so the takeaway here with these graphs show that in what I call the group aware condition, where the humans or the algorithm are able to see the group information, you can see obvious evidence of some discrimination because you see on the x-axis the score of the applicant, on the y-axis the loan offer rate, what percentage of those applicants given that score were offered loans. In red are applicants from the H group. Those are on average have higher quality than and higher scores as a result than the L group. And so on the right-hand side, you see a group blind condition where both humans and algorithms are not able to see the group information. So in the group line as a base case, both algorithm and humans don't really discriminate if we define discrimination as the gap in loan offer rates conditional on having the same score. But on the left-hand side, you see a gap with humans and as well as with algorithms in terms of the rates they're offering loans, conditional and score. But notice that the algorithms gap is much larger than the human beings. And so I find in this particular set of experiments that the algorithms are more accurate in classifying who gets a loan and who doesn't, and this should not be a surprise because prior literature has shown that. But I also show that they're also more discriminatory in that decision-making, which highlights the tension between accuracy and fairness. And so the question that I use this information for is feeds into the next part of the analysis. And what I asked is, well, what are some of the possible downstream effects as a result of this discrimination? And by the way, I forgot to mention that I won't be able to see questions in the chat, but like prior presenters, after I'm done, I'm happy to answer those questions through the chat. So now the question is, what are some of the demand effects of this algorithmic discrimination? And so let's assume we have this person in the middle, let's call him John, and he's interested in getting a loan. And so he's going to be applying to online for a bank, and he has one of two banks he can possibly apply for. Now, John is not aware that there's that there are algorithms at these banks that are making decisions about loans. He just wants to know which bank am I most likely to get a loan from if I'm going to go through all this work of applying for it. And so I assume in my model that he's surveying his network, his social network, to get a sense of where he is most likely to get a loan. And he's going to make that assessment. He's going to ask a simple question. Did you or did you not get a loan in Bank A? Did you or did you not get a loan at Bank B? And he's going to find out by surveying his network what percentage of people got a loan at A or B, but he's going to weight that with a couple of pieces of information, which is one, am I from Bank A and Bank B, what percentage of people like me, meaning my group, also got loans from Bank A and Bank B? And he was also going to weight that with the strength of the ties to these people. And so the assumption here is that if people are doing social learning from others to understand their chance of receiving service, in this case loans, that there may be some additional weight placed on others being most like me, because that becomes more informative. If I'm a woman and I ask everybody I know, what percentage, did you get loans? There might be the preponderance of people who got loans from Bank A, but I've noticed that they're not giving loans to any women, but at Bank B they are. Maybe I will switch my selection to Bank B. So these principles of the decision from the algorithm by the firm and the decisions of the consumers on which banks or services they select were integrated into what's known as an agent-based model. And for those of you who are not familiar with agent-based modeling, it's basically a technique that uses artificial intelligence methods within a simulation context. And so what I'm using here is I'm simulating an ecosystem where banks are making decisions using their algorithms, and I have banks with either a group aware algorithm or a group blind algorithm and making those decisions. And then I have people who are in an ecosystem from one of two groups, the H group or the L group. Think of men and women, for example, who are deciding which banks to go to, conditional on the information they learned from their social network. And so I run this agent-based model over a 5-year timeline, which matches what many firms do in terms of long-range planning. And the question I'm asking here is, over the short run and the long run, which of the two types of algorithms enjoy more demand in terms of applications, and which of the two types of algorithms enjoys greater profit in terms of those who are applying to their banks? What I find is that, in short, the punchline is that algorithmic discrimination, it can actually be profitable in the short run, and this is consistent with prior literature that suggests that if you segment in the ways that we have with commonly used in algorithms, where you're using group information, which should be more informative, apologies, people, my things keeps advancing, that you will have more profits in the short run. But I also find that there's a reversal in that profit over the long run, where it becomes unprofitable in the long run. And so again, what I'm saying is that in the short run, group aware algorithms, and those are the ones with a separate threshold or cutoff but per group, is more profitable compared to the group blind with a single cutoff. But over the long run, it's more that there's a reversal in the group blind algorithms become more profitable than the group aware algorithms. So what drives this? There are factors that drive this, but the key here is word of mouth. And that the word of mouth, the greater the weight that is placed on word of mouth by individuals in their decisions of which banks to select, the more likely and the more profitable the group blind banks end up being. Now, why does profit reverse? So here's the intuition. L group members, for example, women in this example, learn it's tougher to get service at group aware firms than group blind firms. But H group members, for example, men, have a relatively easier time in this example, receiving service anywhere with either type of algorithm. And so the L group and H group members over time learn from each other, and they actually influence each other. And that's a key, that there's influence between the groups of where to go. And a note with this particular approach that I took, word of mouth doesn't have to have any valence. It could be positive, neutral, negative, because the key question here is, where did you ultimately successfully receive service? And that facilitates consumer social learning about likelihood of receiving service for future consumers. So, what I find is that in conclusion, with sufficient word of mouth combined with demand that is greater, combined demand is greater at group line firms in the long run. And so some of the takeaways from this is algorithmic bias can be profitable in the short run, and that might be the reason why so many of these algorithms are used today across firms. But profitability reverses and can reverse in the long run due to word of mouth, reducing consumer demand. And paradoxically, word of mouth does not even have to be negative. It could be positive, it could be neutral, and you would see these findings. And the effects hold even the consumers are completely unaware that the firm uses an algorithm. So it's not about awareness of that the algorithm is being used and that one appears to be more discriminatory than another. You can still see these effects. I want to point out some limitations I have with this. Let me stop and ask, how much time do I have left?
You have 4 minutes.
Excellent. Okay. So with this, there are some limitations I want to point out where these findings may not apply. So there's an assumption with these models that the training data does not have encoded biases within themselves. This is a focus on the design of the algorithm itself. But of course, we know that many sources of algorithm biases about encoded biases based on historical inequities or misrepresentation of the data. So these findings might not apply if that's the source. Another is that group membership is a critical part of the organization's objective, and my findings may not apply. So, for example, I've gotten many questions about what about admissions to universities? Well, many universities have within their objective to have a diverse student body, which means the equivalent of having a need to know of groups both in the dependent variable, both sides of the equation, dependent variable as well as the IV. And so my assumptions here are instead more about using group information to use prior speakers used are more correlational to achieve the objective, for example, profitability. My findings may not apply if word of mouth does not impact consumer choice at all. I can't think of many situations where it would not, but if that's the case, it would not apply. There are no competitive, and then my findings also have an assumption that there's an outside option for consumers to go to. So if everybody, in terms of firms, are using the same kind of algorithm, then the findings would not apply. There was a prior slide where I showed that, for example, word of mouth has a null effect if that's the case. And then finally, group membership attributes need to be observable. If it's not observable by the consumer or the firm, of course, the findings won't apply. But if you use group attributes, for example, like race, gender, to some extent, if you're talking, educational level, et cetera, then it may apply. So for organizations where it can and does apply, where there's service that pre-screen customers, here are my recommendations as a result of this research. Algorithm design is one area of focus where you can consider ignoring group information and the development of the algorithm itself. And when I say ignoring group information, that includes proxy variables, because they're even if you drop sensitive classes, of course, there are proxy variables that can proxy for those groups. Consider including word of mouth in the actual design of the word of mouth forecasting in the actual design of algorithm itself. Consider applying fairness, accountability, and transparency standards, which could include the design of the algorithm itself. And then certainly there can be things done in the training data. And so with this research, of course, learning that higher variation, higher representation in the data, or reduction in the measurement error reduces the discrimination for using a groupware algorithm. And then there's certainly tools out there that can help to detect the bias. So I want to close with this, which is algorithms. They have many potential issues, as has been outlined in this workshop, including the amplifying biases and being a black box and hard to understand. But they present a tremendous opportunity to make data-driven decision-making and provide additional transparency. And so with the right design, data, and policies in place, I personally believe algorithms can actually lead to fair outcomes. But this is what we have to work on collectively today to get there. And so with this, if you have any follow-up questions that we don't get to discuss in this workshop, I'm leaving this contact information. I would be very eager to get feedback and collaborate and discuss with you all. And so thank you.